You're sitting in front of screen. The sounds are familiar, yet strangely distorted. Dull thuds of fists meeting flesh, digital growls echoing through static, and the pulsing glow of a blood-red start button flickering like the heartbeat of something unspoken. You think it's just another fighting game, another VR simulation. But you're wrong. This isn't gameplay. This is an emotional breach. This is a simulation designed not to entertain, but to destabilize your idea of what intimacy can be. Scene 1. A man mid-30s sits in his living room while his wife and child sleep upstairs. He places a neural headset on his head and closes his eyes, not with excitement, but with a heaviness. He's not escaping reality. He's searching for something lost. Not lust, not thrill, but something much simpler and more haunting, the feeling of being noticed. Scene 2. In the game, a sleek, hyperfeminized female avatar grapples with a muscular male opponent. The energy is raw, flashes of neon, guttural grunts, high-impact blows. But then it happens. In the middle of a fight, they freeze. They stare. 1 heartbeat. 2. And then, with no warning, they kiss, a moment completely at odds with the game's design, yet charged with devastating intensity. Scene 3. Back in the real world, a woman stands in her kitchen, holding her husband's forgotten VR controller. She looks out into the night, as if she already knows, but can't find the words to confirm what she suspects. The only sound is the ghost of an old love song echoing from the other room. Talk to me, I just want to talk to you. You think this is a story about cheating. It's not. Striking Vipers isn't about VR affairs or sexual confusion. It's about something far more disturbing. What happens to human intimacy when technology replaces not just bodies, but the emotional architecture that once held us together? The episode doesn't moralize. It doesn't preach. Instead, it floats an idea, quiet, insidious, impossible to shake. When you can love through another body, when desire no longer needs proximity or gender or touch, what remains of the original self? Who is the real you in that equation, the one playing, the one kissing, or the echo of that experience coded into memory? That's the genius of Striking Vipers. Beneath its sci-fi surface lies an emotional paradox. You think you're watching a 3-person drama unravel, but what you're actually witnessing is a generational collapse in how we define connection, identity, and selfhood. The real question the episode leaves behind isn't, what did they do? It's, are we already living in a post-body era where love doesn't require flesh, only interface? Striking Vipers doesn't answer. It doesn't need to. It simply holds up a mirror, fracturing 3 reflections into one. You're watching them. You're judging them. But somewhere in the glow of the screen, you're also seeing yourself. This is not a warning from the future. It's a signal from right now. So come with us, back into the game, where there are no rules, no victors, and no safe exits. Only the glitching truth of who you might become. If San Junipero was the softest dream Black Mirror ever allowed itself to have, Striking Vipers is its unspoken nightmare, the one it wakes from at 3 a.m., flushed and breathless, unsure whether to feel shame or relief. Both episodes were directed by Owen Harris, and both written by Charlie Brooker, but Striking Vipers pushes far deeper into ambiguity. There are no saviors here, no blissful afterlife simulations. Just a raw, uncomfortable exploration of connection without definition. The episode was sparked by what Brooker himself called a twisted little joke. What if Chun-Li and Ryu suddenly kissed mid-fight? That absurd question lingered with him, not for its novelty, but for what it revealed. Our discomfort with gendered expectations, with violence and sensuality existing side by side, and with the possibility that intimacy might take forms we can't name, especially when mediated by immersive technology. Brooker was also drawing from a real-world observation. Middle-aged straight men, he noticed, often inhabit a socially sanctioned emotional numbness. He wondered what would happen if you handed them a safe space to explore not just fantasies but feelings. The result was Striking Vipers, a psychological chamber piece disguised as a tech dystopia. On the surface, it's about gaming. Beneath, it's a treatise on digital desire, shame, identity fluidity, and the hidden emotional lives of men. Filming posed its own set of challenges. The VR sex scenes, despite their intensity, were designed to avoid male gaze exploitation. The team implemented a 3-phase process: intimacy choreography, motion capture, and emotional scripting. Actors Palm Clementif as Roxette and Ludi Lin as Lance never physically touched. Instead, they performed in separate mocap suits while voice actors dubbed the emotional beats. The final animation, with its uncanny first-person shakiness, simulates not just immersion but disorientation, intended to make the audience question their own boundaries of identification and desire. What's lesser known is that an early version of the script actually leaned toward a moral resolution. Danny deletes the game, blocks Carl, recommits to family life. Parts of this were even shot. But in post-production screenings, the team agreed it felt dishonest. Too easy. Too neat. Too much like what society expects a man to do. So they chose something riskier, an open-ended compromise where no one wins, but no one lies either. Everyone gets a little freedom, but they all lose a piece of themselves in the process. One of the most quietly subversive elements of the episode is its all-black cast, not just for representation, but as a provocation. In an interview, Brooker revealed his intent. If you can change your body, gender, and even orientation in VR, does racial coding still haunt your desires? The implication is chilling. Even in virtual utopia, the ghosts of social structure, race, class, power still cling. You can change your avatar, but you can't always rewrite your inheritance. What makes Striking Vipers truly unforgettable isn't its VR sex premise, it's the way it weaponizes visual and auditory design to interrogate the border between desire and reality. In this episode, cinematography and sound aren't accessories. They're architecture. The camera speaks louder than any dialogue ever could. Start with the color palette. Danny's real-world life is cloaked in muted blues and pale grays. The sticky note on the fridge, the faded cotton bedsheets, the amber lamp glow, all radiate emotional entropy, not unhappiness, but numbness. The moment we shift into the game world, the palette explodes. Deep purples, electric reds, high-sheen skin lit by flickering neon. The VR environment feels like a cross between Blade Runner and Street Fighter, a digital erotic jungle where identity melts and adrenaline burns. The contrast makes a silent claim. Here, in code, they feel more alive than they ever do in flesh. Camera work follows suit. In domestic scenes, the camera maintains distance, long shots, side profiles, oblique angles. There's always space between the characters. But inside the game, the POV becomes disarmingly intimate, often simulating the character's eyes. Every caress, breath, twitch of lip, or gasp of pain is in your face, on your skin. This simulated first-person empathy forces us to ask, are we watching their desire or recognizing our own? The arc of Carl is perhaps the most layered. He begins as a cliché, ladies' man, club hopper, charisma machine. But as he embodies Roxette, he softens, exploring a liminal space between masculinity and femininity. He paints his nails. He modulates his voice. He gazes at himself in the mirror and murmurs, "If I were a woman, would you still love me?" Carl isn't transitioning. He's discovering. And that's what makes his journey unsettling. It exists beyond categories. Danny's arc is more defensive. He doesn't reject Carl. He rejects what Carl awakens in him. The realization that identity, especially masculine identity, is more fragile and more fluid than he ever dared admit. Symbolism runs thick. The avatar names, Lance and Roxette, aren't just gendered, they're semiotic markers. Lance as phallic weapon, Roxette as 80s glam icon. Together, they stage a fight not just between characters, but between social roles encoded in the muscle memory of masculinity and femininity. The game's fatal kiss move is more than a gimmick. It mirrors the episode's emotional climax. When affection finally breaks through aggression, the result isn't release, it's devastation. The kiss is lethal not because it kills, but because it reveals. Perhaps the most overlooked symbolic moment happens quietly. Danny's son builds a toy robot in the background while a retro arcade commercial plays on TV. In that fleeting image, father and son, past and future, fantasy and inheritance, the episode whispers its cruelest truth, that our desires are built, passed down, programmed. And sometimes even love can't rewire them. Structurally, Striking Vipers is deceptively simple. It follows a classical three-act format: introduction, escalation, and resolution. But this simplicity is a trap. It demands precision, and it demands nerve. And that's where the episode excels. In Act 1, we witness reunion and reactivation. Danny's birthday brings Carl back into his life, along with a gift that's less about nostalgia than it is about reawakening repressed desire. Act 2 charts the spiral. Their virtual encounters intensify, boundaries blur, and emotional fallout begins to tear through Danny's marriage and sense of self. Act 3 delivers neither closure nor collapse, but compromise, a warped, negotiated peace where nobody gets exactly what they want, but nobody explodes either. This isn't a story about infidelity or loyalty, it's about how we name the connections society hasn't yet built language for. Director Owen Harris builds upon the digital emotional grammar he developed in San Junipero, where VR served as a vessel for pure feeling. But here, he flips that model. VR in Striking Vipers is no longer sanctuary. It's a pressure chamber. A mirror that doesn't reflect what you look like, but what you refuse to see. Harris's greatest formal risk lies in how he handles nonlinear desire. Characters don't move in arcs, they circle, regress, hesitate, freeze. The audience is denied catharsis at every turn. Instead of closure, we get queasy ambiguity. Not horror, not satire. Just an ethical unease that makes you squirm because no one in the story has done anything wrong, and yet something feels off. This emotional sleight of hand led many critics to redefine the episode not as sci-fi, but as an intimacy thriller, a slow-burn exploration of the rules we silently agree to in relationships, and what happens when those rules are rewritten without permission. Such narrative choices have deeply polarized critics and scholars alike. On one side are those who praise the episode for breaking the illusion of straight male invulnerability, and for daring to explore the soft tissue where identity, desire, and technology converge. On the other are those who call it evasive, not queer enough, not bold enough, too dependent on technical metaphors to say anything concrete about real-world queer experience. One key criticism centers on Carl's identity. Though he embodies a female avatar, he never seeks gender transition in real life. For some trans viewers, this felt like a cop-out, a story about identity fluidity that refuses to grapple with the social and structural realities of transitioning bodies. Yet others argue the very point of the episode is its refusal to settle. It isn't unclear, it's unresolved. By refusing to offer clear definitions, it reflects a world where identity is in motion, where feelings don't fit into categories, and where love doesn't always know its name. That tension between naming and negating, between structure and slippage, is perhaps Striking Vipers' most radical act. At its core, Striking Vipers is not a story about virtual sex. It's an allegory about repression, emotional, psychological, and social. What makes the episode so unsettling isn't its boundary-pushing concept, but the realization it unveils. We already live inside a prison of sanctioned desires, and technology is simply the flashlight that exposes its walls. Every relationship in the story is animated not by deviance, but by displacement. Danny, trapped in the inertia of suburban middle-class routine, hasn't cheated on his wife. But he has become inert, unseen, uninvited, emotionally dormant. He doesn't want escape. He wants reactivation. Carl, on the other hand, has all the sexual freedom he could want, but no sense of being seen. His flings leave him cold. What he longs for isn't the body of Roxette, but the gaze, the moment someone looks at him and tells him who he is again. This emotional fracture speaks to a wider socio-cultural malaise. We live in an age of decentralized connection, fragmented intimacy, and fluid identity. Technology doesn't cause these problems, it amplifies and accelerates them. It pushes replaceability to the edge. You can swap bodies, toggle gender, simulate affection. But the one thing that cannot be replicated is that moment of mutual recognition, of being truly felt by another sentient being. This lies at the heart of the show's primary dramatic triangle, Danny, Carl, and Theo. It's not a love triangle, it's a conflict model of three symbolic forces. Danny represents a struggling father figure caught between legacy and longing. Carl stands for the destabilized masculine ID, searching for meaning in fluidity. And Theo? She's not just the wife. She's the third axis, the often ignored emotional intelligence of women, the invisible labor of noticing, confronting, absorbing. That's what makes the final compromise so jarring. Theo doesn't scream. She doesn't leave. She asserts. Her demand for her own night out isn't revenge, it's a restructuring of power. No one wins, but no one is silenced either. What emerges is not peace, but a realignment of agency. Viewed through this lens, Striking Vipers becomes less a cautionary tale and more a speculative social diagram. The VR encounters aren't about eroticism, they're parables of our crumbling emotional contracts. In this universe, love has become a login ritual and desire a programmable interface. And from a mythic vantage point, Striking Vipers fits snugly into Black Mirror's long tradition of technological parables. Like its predecessors, It doesn't warn us of what might come. It reveals what's already here. It doesn't ask, what if the future is like this? It whispers, isn't it already? When Striking Vipers aired, the cultural response was sharply divided. For some, it was a bold interrogation of repressed male intimacy, relationship fatigue, and the ambiguous spaces between technology and identity. For others, it was an awkward attempt, an experimental misfire that didn't commit hard enough to its themes and left too many questions unanswered. This polarization is precisely what gives the episode its social weight. Striking Vipers doesn't tackle homosexuality. It doesn't portray gender transition. Instead, it dares to step into the undefined territory of tech-mediated, emergent desire, a realm without language, without consensus, without scripts. And it does so without preaching or labeling. That ambiguity isn't a failure. It's a form of moral provocation. In terms of demographic impact, the group most affected might be surprising: heterosexual men. For once, they are not portrayed as stoic warriors, comic bros, or tragic patriarchs. They're confused, tender, vulnerable, and treated seriously. Online forums saw an influx of men saying, "I've never seen a version of myself like that on screen." For these viewers, the episode didn't attack masculinity, it dismantled its armor. And yet, many female viewers responded with ambivalence, if not frustration. Theo, while not sidelined, is placed in the position of quiet tolerator. In the final agreement, what looks like mutual compromise can also be read as emotional concession. She loses her husband's emotional exclusivity, yet chooses to preserve the structure of the family. This sparked broader debates. Must women always absorb the shockwaves of male identity crises? And what about the tech itself? The VR company behind Striking Vipers X is almost entirely absent from the narrative. But in that absence lies its critique. These platforms present themselves as neutral playgrounds, but in reality, they curate psychosexual experiences without accountability. When Carl says, "It's better than real sex," we're not just hearing a character's confusion. We're witnessing a shift in the politics of pleasure. That's the core tension Striking Vipers embodies. It walks the edge of ethical lines without collapsing into ideology. It doesn't lecture. It disturbs. It invites you to sit with contradictions you can't resolve and asks a question that echoes far beyond the episode. What if I, too, have made a choice inside a system I don't understand? Few questions haunt the human imagination like this. If I could become you, would I finally understand you? Across decades of cinema, the idea of body swapping has endured as one of the most symbolic, pliable, and philosophically charged narrative devices. Whether through magic, science, accident, or design, the ability to inhabit someone else's body has functioned not only as plot twist, but as existential hypothesis, offering not just character transformation, but a mirror held up to the viewer's own sense of self. Historically, we can observe three distinct cinematic waves of the body swap motif, each reflecting different cultural anxieties. The earliest wave, spanning from the 1970s through the 1990s, was dominated by comedic and family-oriented narratives. Films like Freaky Friday, 1976, remade in 2003, Vice Versa, 1988, and Big, 1988, used body swapping primarily as a tool for empathy and reconciliation. Whether mother-daughter, father-son, or child-adult, these swaps were emotionally restorative. They involved magical premises, light consequences, and a return to the status quo once the moral lesson was learned. Identity was elastic but ultimately stable. Transformation led to insight, not fragmentation. But beginning in the late 1990s, a darker wave emerged, one that treated body swapping not as a source of catharsis, but as a site of horror, power struggles, and moral ambiguity. John Woo's Face/Off, 1997, turned the swap into a war mask, with characters literally weaponizing each other's faces. Pedro Almodovar's The Skin I Live In, 2011, took the conceit to a chilling extreme, where gender transformation becomes an act of revenge and possession. Jordan Peele's Get Out, 2017, reframed the entire concept through a racialized lens, where the white elite hijacked black bodies as vessels, exposing how colonial desires persist beneath surgical precision. In these films, swapping no longer fosters connection, it desecrates it. Identity becomes an unstable currency, and the body a battleground. In recent years, we've entered a third stage, one shaped not by physical transformation, but by digital abstraction. Identity, in the 2020s, is no longer bound to the body at all. Series like Upload, 2020, or films like Everything Everywhere All at Once, 2022, depict selves that are endlessly replicable, mutable, or interchangeable across virtual or multiversal systems. Here, the body is just an interface, a user shell. The real drama isn't who you are, but which version of yourself you choose to inhabit. Identity becomes a software environment. It is in this third space that Striking Vipers stakes its claim, not by reiterating the classic body swap formula, but by deconstructing it. There's no spell, no accident, no surgery. Instead, there's a conscious act of technological immersion. Danny and Carl don't literally swap bodies, but in choosing avatars with radically different gender configurations and sexual capacities, they initiate a psychological swap. What makes it subversive is not what they do in the game, it's what it forces them to confront about who they are outside of it. This form of substitution is eerily modern. Danny, still physically male, begins to experience pleasure and affect through a hypersexualized female body. He doesn't identify as a woman, but he can't deny the emotional intensity of the experience. Meanwhile, Carl's embodiment of Roxette isn't mere roleplay. It becomes a genuine identity exploration. His preferences evolve. His behavior shifts. Yet, in the real world, he remains socially coded as straight and male. The simulation grants them liberation, but the dissonance between virtual self and physical identity becomes unbearable. What's particularly radical about Striking Vipers is that this swap is not accidental. Unlike most entries in the genre, which rely on external triggers, a curse, a lightning strike, a malfunction, the swap here is voluntary. It's something they seek. It's a chosen fantasy, and thus ethically far messier. This marks a philosophical break from traditional body swap narratives. Instead of being thrown into someone else's world, they opt out of their own. In that sense, Striking Vipers is not a VR remix of Freaky Friday. It's a techno-existential extension of the body swap idea, where the body is no longer the object of transformation. It is the obstacle. The swap isn't between person A and person B. It's between human experience and algorithmic simulation. Is less about becoming the other and more about becoming a version of yourself that only exists in code. This brings us to the episode's most unnerving implication. The next stage of swapping may no longer be between individuals. It will be between people and systems. Not just you in my body, but you replaced by a programmable routine. In this future, desire is outsourced. Emotional intimacy is mediated. Bodies are interfaces and identities are server-side scripts. That is the terrifying beauty of Striking Vipers. It masquerades as a story about two friends who cross a virtual line, but it's really a blueprint for a world in which the ultimate intimacy is no longer with another human, but with the system that understands you better than you understand yourself. When Striking Vipers first aired, it was received as futuristic speculation, a wild what-if scenario. But half a decade later, it feels less like a prediction and more like a mirror that got here early. Its power lies not in sci-fi spectacle, but in emotional precision. It didn't show us what's coming. It showed us what's already here, just hidden. Let's start with what once seemed far-fetched, immersive virtual intimacy. Today we have VR chat romances, metaverse dating, haptic suits, customizable AI companions. People now form meaningful, even exclusive, emotional bonds with entities that do not breathe. Striking Vipers anticipated this shift with haunting clarity. When Carl says, "I've tried real people, but they're not like you," that line could easily come from someone using Replica or Project Cupid. The problem is no longer whether human-machine relationships are possible. It's whether human-human relationships can survive in a world where tech offers satisfaction without consequence. Tech hasn't liberated desire, it's reformatted the economics of intimacy. Affection becomes programmable. Rejection becomes deletable. Risk becomes off-switchable. That's the philosophical wound Striking Vipers reopens. If technology can simulate everything we crave, what's left for flawed, real-life love to offer? This is no longer theoretical. Therapists and educators report rising cases of young people raised in digitally mediated relationships struggling to navigate real-world friction. They crave emotional predictability. They expect fail-safes. But human intimacy is inherently messy, unscripted, and volatile. The game doesn't teach you how to sit with discomfort. And Striking Vipers knew that before we did. While the episode doesn't prescribe solutions, it does imply 3 actionable areas for social response. Social training must be recalibrated. Emotional negotiation, boundary recognition, and rupture repair must be taught like language or coding. In a post-physical world, emotional literacy is survival. Marriage norms must evolve responsibly. We can't force outdated templates onto 21st century desires. Relationship models must allow flexibility, but also require accountability. Structure, not suppression. Tech ethics must expand beyond data. We regulate food and medicine. We must also evaluate immersive technology, not just for physical safety, but psychological dependency and effective addiction. Ethics should anticipate harm, not just litigate it. In short, Striking Vipers isn't a story about tomorrow. It's an emotional fire drill for today. It isn't warning us about desire run wild. It's asking, are we ready for what happens when our hearts run on code? Striking Vipers didn't light up the trending tabs the way San Junipero or USS Callister did. It didn't spawn memes or mainstream catchphrases. Instead, it did something subtler. It burrowed into niche communities and changed the conversation from inside out. Among LGBTQ+ forums, men's mental health networks, digital intimacy researchers, and AI ethics scholars, the episode became a kind of canonical case study in intimacy tech friction. One of its most visible aftershocks was the rise of the hashtag virtual cheating discourse. Across Reddit, Tumblr, and Quora, thousands debated a deceptively simple question. If you sleep with someone in VR, does it count as cheating? The answers varied, but what emerged was more telling than any consensus. In dissecting the fictional dilemma, people began confessing real-life ethical ambiguities. Striking Vipers didn't invent the tension, it just named what was already unspoken. Even more interesting was the shift in how audiences related to content. Instead of traditional plot-based empathy, the episode provoked what might be called structural identification. Viewers weren't just asking, "Do I like these characters?" They were asking, "If I were inside this world, what would I do?" That's a new kind of mirror and a new kind of fear. To deepen this reflective mode of engagement, here are 4 underrated films and 4 essential books that resonate with Striking Vipers at a structural, not just thematic, level. Films. Possessor, 2020, Brandon Cronenberg. A cyberpsychological thriller about consciousness hijacking and the ethics of bodily invasion. The One I Love, 2014, Charlie McDowell. A surreal marital drama where couples confront uncanny doppelgangers, blurring desire and self-perception. Perfect Blue, 1997, Satoshi Kon. A haunting anime about virtual personas overtaking reality, fame, and the horror of internal fragmentation. Her Smell, 2018, Alex Ross Perry. A raw, disjointed dive into the psychological breakdown of identity within intimacy and fame. Books. The Erotic Engine, Patchen Barse. A cultural history of how technology has always been driven by erotic need and how it shapes our desires. Technologies of the Self, Michel Foucault et al. Philosophical inquiry into how individuals craft identity through power, norms, and self-discipline. The Cybernetic Hypothesis, Ticken. A radical political text on how modern systems use feedback loops to condition human behavior. Alone Together, Sherry Tickle. A seminal sociological exploration of the paradoxical intimacy in the digital age, why we crave connection but fear closeness. Together, these texts help reframe Striking Vipers not as an anomaly, but as a node in a much larger cultural operating system. They remind us, this isn't just a Black Mirror episode. It's an encrypted message from the near present. If I were a woman, would you still love me? When Carl whispers those words, the gravity of the entire episode shifts. What began as a story about gaming, technology, and sex is stripped bare to reveal a far more disquieting question at its core. Who do we love? And on what grounds do we justify that love? This isn't a question that detonates, it lingers. It pulses beneath the surface like a low-frequency moral tremor, destabilizing our most familiar frameworks. It's not merely a question of sexuality, it's a challenge to the very scaffolding of emotional structure. We tend to believe that intimacy is built through presence, routine, shared time, and the human body. Striking Vipers dissolves that belief like static on a digital screen. It shows us that you can experience a moment of connection more intense than a decade of marriage, without scent, without warmth, without sound. You can feel something realer than sex, without even touching another human being. What breaks isn't fidelity. What breaks is the boundary between self and simulation. This episode isn't about betrayal, it's about identity overload. When you can become anyone, you may forget how to stay someone. You begin to question the validity of your own feelings. You no longer know whether your desire is real or just a residual function of the interface. And that's the true nerve the show touches, the desperate hunger not just to be loved, but to be seen. In the real world, these men are adrift, overwhelmed by adulthood, masculinity, monotony. But inside a synthetic skin, through borrowed sensations and filtered voices, they are finally able to evoke a reaction, even if that reaction comes from a digitally remapped version of themselves. That's why the show is so disturbing. There is no villain, no evil AI, no broken system, no dystopian corporation to blame. There is only choice. And choice, when unexamined, can become the most elegant form of self-erasure. Many viewers reported feeling emotionally displaced by the final agreement between Danny, Carl, and Theo. And perhaps that's the point. Even when no one loses, everyone sacrifices. Even when everyone consents, no one escapes. Interestingly, a deleted scene was meant to show a global leaderboard for Striking Viper's X, peak user stats, top-selling intimacy plugins, heat maps of simultaneous encounters across Seoul, Sao Paulo, and Los Angeles. The director cut it. If you tell the audience the future is already here, he said, they shrug. But if you say nothing, they realize they've already stepped into it. So now the question isn't in the episode. It's in your hands. If you were Danny, what would you choose? If you were Carl, could you accept the evolution of your desire? If you were Theo, would you live with a marriage haunted by the ghost of a digital love? Do you dare to share a relationship from your life that defies logic but feels undeniably real? Or maybe just drop one emoji: passion, confusion, heartbreak, numbness. You don't have to explain. That's the point. The real mirror isn't in the screen. It's staring back from your own reflection.